Okay, so we are now on recording. So hi everyone, welcome to the catalog sync. And this has been 1 week of break from the last one, and we have made quite some progress on quite a few work items. So for highlights, first of all, thanks Edward for driving the endpoint discovery discussions, and the PR has been merged. And also thanks Amok for the two changes to first clarify the requirement update with unknown requirements, and also added the remove partition spec update as a new action type. So these are the highlights I have captured. Anything else that people want to bring up? Okay, so I guess we can move to the discussions. So the first topic I see is namespace separator. I think there's a voting thread which didn't have many votes, and there's an ongoing PR. Uh, what are our thoughts here? Do we still have any further concerns about the current approach?
Well, I think I haven't taken a look at the latest on the thread if anybody else has voted yet. I think the question really comes down to, we had a -1 on the approach. And generally we've said we want to achieve consensus across the community. And so we may want to take this and discuss a little bit further to make sure that there isn't like strong opposition, that we are actually aligned. And I think that that's probably what kind of slowed down the voting process here. It is a little abnormal for the community to be in this position. Brian, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, like I think given our existing stance that we don't want to solve technical discussions through a vote, right? Now, I think that it was reasonable because I kind of was also wondering whether the objection was going to be like a no, I really can't see this going in type of objection, or just a I have concerns but -0 kind of thing. But given that it is like a firm objection, I think we do need to figure out how to move forward here. I think the larger concern from my perspective is that it doesn't really look like the conversation is progressing. I've seen a lot of the same assertions over and over, and not really acknowledgement or digging in and saying, here's why I think that current clients are not broken, or something like that. So honestly, I think this is something that we need to think about. It's probably a good thing that we're taking a minute and not just going back and forth on it. Like, take some time for everyone to not think about it, reconsider, and then come back to this. But it is an existing problem for for catalogs. Luckily, we've solved the problem for ourselves by using a different method. And so I don't know. I think this is something that the community needs to fix, but it's not currently blocking anyone that I know about.
Yeah, I would say that like there is a need to address this problem. And the spectrum of options that we have in front of us range from doing something like what's proposed to doing something really radical that would significantly impact a large portion of what the current REST specification is. And it seems like a relatively small issue. We're talking about namespace separators. A lot of catalogs don't really leverage that in a way that would impact their implementations. There are a few out there, but we also have this looming cliff of, if the new servlet implementations start enforcing this, or other things that we've run into like WAFs and things that people put into their infrastructure start enforcing these new recommendations about like dealing with path characters, we have like this problem that is emerging. And if we don't have a solution now, it's going to be more problematic when there are, you know, CVEs or security reasons why people are pushing for upgrades. So there isn't like a super urgency, but it is something that I think we should address. But it's also something that I don't want to overreact to and like go and change the entire REST specification around the delimiter character. So I would say let's take this offline, go back to the lists, spend a little bit more time on it, but ultimately, like, we do need to figure out a path forward.
Yeah, I was kind of busy with internal stuff, so I wasn't looking to the development. I see Robert commented that some of the concerns has been proactively resolved, so maybe we can chat with him offline about this.
Yeah, I think we just need to figure out a way forward, or yeah, figure out as the PMC what to do here, which I know we like to avoid, or at least I like to avoid.
I think I'm overall okay with the server side provide a separator, but I also like the Jack's idea, which is happens within the AWS, that client side can send its own separator to let server side to know, okay, we want to be separated by these characters. The question is, do we need both of them, or we just we can have conversion to one of them? For example, if the client side is the one we want to go in, then we can just do the client side. Because there's some concern, like security concern from client side configuration, but if that is resolvable, then we can just go with that way.
Well, so I agree with Russell's perspective here, which is that I think excuse me, I think for the vast majority of cases, we don't want to burden users or anyone with this choice. So I like the service being able to send a separator to the client and say like, hey, here's the separator I want you to use, done. Just so that we don't have users exposed to this problem. I think that's the easiest. Like the client side separator just seems to me like we're potentially exposing this problem too much to people. That said, like between those two, I don't have like a, you know, very firmly held opinion. I think we just need to solve this problem. But I am also thinking about this problem in the narrow case, which is like, what is the separator? Not do we need to support, you know, all URL encoded characters or things like that. I think that is a related problem, but probably separate. And I think we need to have a position on both of those. You know, whether we are going to try to solve the encodings that for like printable characters that are bad, or just, you know, limit ourselves to the rejected non-printable characters.
The other thing that I would add is just that taking the server side approach, like a couple of the arguments that were made is like servers are more likely to know what restrictions that they have and to select a character that makes sense for their particular use case. Like they can select a character that they don't support, or, you know, but support in the actual like name fields. The server has more of those restrictions where a client wouldn't necessarily know that about the server. But also, this isn't a one-way door. Like we can add the server side capability, and then later, if there are real use cases for the client side definition, we can add that, you know, on top of this. So it isn't that like this restricts us from doing the client side. It just unblocks us from the current situation that's emerging with the new servlet restrictions.
That's a good call out.
Yeah, I also agree. I actually just approved the PR that Edward put up like in the morning, because I agree this is kind of like a two-way door situation. Also, even for the example I put up, I think I was using a historical example of Glue, which has basically no limitation on the name of the database. And but actually, in practice, we never recommend people to use like special characters, and even there are some characters that if the user uses, it will actually break the system. So, so from that perspective, the server does actually know what are the characters that cannot be used in most situations. So if it cannot, we can try to not expose that to the user. That would be ideal. And the client side is kind of like the most flexible way. I just want to put up as an option there.
The other thing that I wanted to raise, because I think it was lost in the discussion a little bit, was whether it's actually a character or it's a character sequence. And I think we actually said it's a character sequence. So you can actually combine characters to get something that you wouldn't expect to see.
Triple underscore.
Yeah, triple underscore, you know, $4 signs, like, you know, whatever it is that that you can actually support. And I think that that provides a little bit more flexibility for those cases where you're concerned that, like, hey, a double underscore or an underscore or a pipe, or, you know, whatever it is that you're picking could be problematic. Well, you can create whatever sequence makes sense for you. And then it's just a matter of like preserving the readability of the URL. Like that's the only piece that, you know, like how much does that matter for you?
I think unfortunately everyone here is largely in agreement. So we'll have to, yeah, I think let this cool down period end. Go back and re-raise this discussion thread. And if we can't come to an agreement, we'll, you know, figure out how to break a deadlock via PMC.
And I would just point out, like, there's no upper limit on a vote for time. So like we can leave the vote out there. We can figure out what the path forward is and we can come back to it.
Okay, any other comments before we move to the next topic?
Not from me.
Okay, so the next topic is support row filter and column masking in RESTback. And this is related to a thread that Shoham raised on the dev list. So, I mean, personally, I'm pretty passionate about the topic. I have raised quite a few proposals in this domain. So curious what people think on this.
So where we last left off on this feature, you know, I think column filtering is, you know, or column masking, those things are pretty straightforward. This idea of, hey, can the catalog have policy for fine-grained access controls and communicate that to trusted clients that will implement those policies, right? Reading the column and, you know, only showing the last 4 digits or something like that. Where we left that was we have this open question about how would we do more complex row level filters, specifically those filters, I think, that require joins against other tables. Now, I said I think because I don't think that we ever move past that question, right? There was a suggestion to include an arbitrary SQL blob in this, which I am, you know, pretty strongly opposed to, because I think including SQL in the access control layer and needing to parse that pretty much, you know, excludes all Rust and Python clients and things like that. And I would much rather see if there is a design that can accommodate those uses without resorting to raw SQL and or arbitrary SQL strings. I think that the next steps where we left it were, what are the use cases that we're trying to target? And I think it would be good to get back to what exactly are those use cases and how do we do them? And I would also point out here that there's another option. If we do want the arbitrary, like any access control policy through a query, it may just be a better thing to focus our efforts on secure views. That is, views that if I trust an engine, I will provide that engine access to the underlying tables because I trust that the engine will only show the data for the view. So that is, I think, a very reasonable fallback to a lot of these cases, because we know that this is actually a very common pattern to use a view. And in fact, I think we were also thinking that if you have this policy, you could just replace the table with a view when you load it. And so like, I think that there's a very good argument for simply having a secure view. But again, it comes back to what are the use cases that we're really targeting here? And I don't think that we've quite defined that.
So I guess I can try to recap the context here, because it's also quite some time back for me. The use case when we put out the proposal for row filtering was regarding their and also regarding the use case of a drawing. It's usually there's a table that is recording who has access to what, and then the row filter policy is going to specify that based on, for example, a function like current user, and you select the whatever you have access to in that table, and then map to access to the current table. I think there was an example that is put up in the proposal, which is kind of using the snowflake row filter um, syntax. And I think that was quite a common use case that we were trying to achieve, because it seems like that is kind of fixed pattern for when we did a survey about how Microsoft SQL Server and Snowflake and Redshift, these engines did row filtering. Those are kind of the recurring examples in their documentations.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, if we have defined the use cases that we're targeting with this, then and that's like this join use case, right? Current user is used to select a, say, list of regions for which I can see data, and then I, go and use a inquiry to down to that list of regions. I think that that's great. Like, really, the next step from my perspective was, what is the use case we're targeting, and confirming yes or no that we can or cannot, represent that in some way other than arbitrary SQL.
I think for me, I like the secure view approach, just to be honest, because and also that's one of the options put up in the original proposal we had, because secure view is also something that kind of is there. The concept is very well defined, and also in the end, the implementation of many engines is kind of converting that into a secure view to be executed. So to me, if people think that is a good path forward, then I think we can resolve this kind of drawing case in that approach. And then the question, going back to the row filter, is that if the secure view is, we think, a good approach for that, then do we still want to go back to have another kind of simplified version of simple row filters embedded in like table response to be applied, or do we just go straight into secure views for everything?
I would say that I can imagine that there are cases where you want to do something simple in the table, case, where it's column masking or some of those other ones that we've discussed. I think even in those cases, there's complexity of like, well, how do you do the transform for the mask operation? Like, what does that actually look like? Is that engine dependent? And the nice thing about the secure views is we already have the dialect approach. So you can construct a secure view for the dialect of the engine that's actually consuming the view to produce whatever results you're looking for. And I think that would be hard in the load table path without basically re-implementing everything that we did for views with ILX. So I still think that there is a potential case where you want to, through load table, identify at least like maybe columns that users shouldn't have access to, or something that is more coarse-grained. But that should be driven by use cases. Like if most of what everybody's looking for just leans into the secure views, why invest in building that out for the load table case? But I'm open to it. I just think that, like,
I think perhaps one of the things that would work for the load table case, or an argument for load table, is the non-SQL engines that we want to support. So if you have a case where you've got a sensitive column, are you going to prevent people from accessing that from Rust or Python? Probably not. Well, actually, sorry, I don't know what I was thinking there. Rust and Python are user controlled, so there's no way you trust them to do that anyway. Never mind.
Yeah. So there's the rub. Like, you have to have both the combination of a secure environment that you can trust that they're going to apply that, whatever that policy is, correctly. And most of the cases where you wouldn't have that is in user control, and so you wouldn't be able to leverage that anyway. So I think that there is a question of, like, how much overlap do we have in the use cases there? Where the secure view one, I think we're talking about more of the robust implementations. If they're implementing secure views, they're probably, a execution engine, and it's a secure environment where you can trust the actual processing of it. Yufei, sorry, I missed what the comment. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to trust the engine, and the Python and Rust one, you completely control by the user who is using that. I'm with you guys that I think secure view probably is the way to move forward, because we don't want to add another complexity on top of that.
So I think if our path forward is secure view, then let's see how far we can get with that, and see if other use cases come up for this. Like I like the idea of using what we already have to move forward, and not need to define any additional things here. Dennis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, and sorry, I might have missed this part of prior discussion, but about the use cases where the context is useful for other kinds of access control related decisions, also still in load table. I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, this idea of, okay, there are the category of things that fundamentally need a trusted engine. Some that might be cooperative, as in, like, maybe the engine knows how to enforce certain elements of things, but ideally to have a mechanism for some form of defense in depth, right? And I guess it comes down to, like, something like credential downscoping. So one example is something more fine-grained than something that would fit entirely into necessarily needing an engine to be trusted, and already is something that is a current use case. It's not like a new access control use case. Would be, for example, if you want a vended credential to also be able to list objects in addition to being able to get objects. And then in this case, for example, some engines might need to fall back to being able to list objects because of loading, like, a Hadoop file IO. And a vended credential should include a list.
So you're saying that your catalog needs to, oh, okay. So you're saying you're pointing at a Hadoop catalog?
Yeah, or something that decides to list things under the hood for whatever reason, like, and you don't know, right? So maybe the catalog doesn't know it's necessarily a Hadoop catalog, but it's a client that wants to do listing for some reason.
I think that for the Hadoop catalog case, which I think is unique, you would want the service, the REST catalog service, to identify the latest metadata file and send that to the client, right? Because that's part of the REST protocol. So I don't think you would ever need to list.
But these
There
are
are
two
use cases where you
different concerns, I think, though, because like the what comes back from the load table versus what access is allowed in like a vended credential case, like those are independent things. And like, so you can't like violate anything in the vended credential because that's being enforced by something entirely different than the catalog or whatever the catalog sends back to you in that response. So I'm not sure how those two actually interact in a way that matters here.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Maybe it boils down to like the fact that tightly coupling credential vending to load table in the first place was kind of just a workaround in a way, right?
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Well, the idea being that when you load table metadata, I guess like loading table metadata is a different operation than requesting a credential for doing other things, right? Like your context might involve, like you might not be loading for example, if your intent is to update a table, then you're requesting a credential to perform the update. That intent might not be conveyed in the load table, but I guess I am kind of maybe like going out of scope of the original discussion here. So maybe we can return to that. Like,
I think that's a little bit valid concern, like because we actually talking about two different stuff here. First is from the secure semantics, what we can do with the low level of filtering, as well as the column masking, right? That's, I agree. Secure view probably is the way to go. Another thing I think Dennis maybe touch on upon a little bit is about how do we control through the credential vending, how to control the underlayer file level access control. Do we want to do that? First question, of course, do we want to do that? This is possible through the catalogs, right? Because through the vendor credential vending, you can actually control the capability to deal with the file listing, writing, reading, right? You can deal with that. This is completely different from the other thing we're talking about, but that is possible.
Yeah, and maybe I can also clarify. Like the other thing I had in mind was about right, instead of a secure views approach for some kinds of column level access controls, right? If something like Parquet modular encryption could be used to control inherent column access. So like if you get into the world where like you also have to vend a different set of things in order to be able to access certain categories of data, then that could be baked into the access control decision in an inherent way, right? And that would rely on that context exchange information where you're doing it at load table time instead of just the secure view approach.
True. Yeah. You could vend keys and things like that. I think that's a good thought experiment for future iterations of the protocol. I'm not sure that I think that has a lot more plausible use than like a listing operation. Although like if you wanted to run orphan data files yourself, cool.
Right.
Yeah, you would probably want something that can do that recursive listing and all that. I think my main reaction to that is hopefully these are catalog level decisions. And so like we want the protocol to largely be independent of how you want to structure your credentials that are vended or things like that. And one more point there is like you're right about the intent, So if the intent could be passed, right? Like I know I'm just going to read this table, and so I don't need the credential that has write permission. Then that would be really nice for sort of a defense in depth argument. I think the counter to that is our own API doesn't allow us to pass the reason why the table is being loaded. It could be an explain operation for an update. It could be an update query, but all we get back from the engine is load this table, which is, I guess, probably your argument for if we were to separate the credential from the credential from that load table, how we would move on.
I want to jump in just because like I think we're veering off into a territory of exploration that doesn't align with my understanding of like how most security works today. Like when you're working with like a cloud provider or something like that, you assume a role, you get the privileges of that role. Anything you interact with, you like, you're not expressing the intent of like, hey, I want to do this thing, so give me just the access to do this thing. No, I am a principal, and that relates to some sort of, you know, role or something that has a set of privileges. You don't go and express like a downscope version of what you want to have access to. If you want to control what the access is, you downscope the privileges on whatever they can assume to perform that operation. So like what we're talking about is like a little backwards. And I don't even know of any database systems that really work like this where, you know, hey, if I'm going to like go and perform a select on a table, if I've got update, it doesn't mean that like, hey, it's not going to allow me to update the table in a session. It's never expressing the intent that way. It's a, you've got the set of privileges that you're allowed to operate against whatever resources you've been given access to.
Yeah, and actually, I think that raises a really good point about like making a distinction between how what roles mean in different contexts. Because you know, I think this has been one of the classic things where nobody agrees on what a role is. But there, we did, you know, I think there are somewhat two categories of things that of patterns that are often used. And what you talk about, what you mentioned about scoping one's privileges in sort of an existing sort of role identity versus having a different hat that you put on has been one that I've seen it make a you know, sort of swing as a pendulum. Like in OAuth, there's always been the notion of scopes, right, where you in concept it's like the same identity, but the scopes, I guess in some ways you could call them roles, but also you could think of them as like boundaries around around an existing role. And like if you think of how like with Google's credential access boundary, you know, it really does feel like you're applying an additional boundary on top of an existing role, if you will. But in other cases, it might look like you're assuming a different role. Like in some databases, you have concepts of like so like in Snowflake, for example, you have primary roles and you have database roles. You also have your additional activated roles. So you in simple cases, maybe you're acting as one particular role. In some other cases, you might be using roles as a privilege expansion grouping mechanism. But maybe more to the point, it does seem like right now there is concretely in credential bending for both, at least for, you know, Google and AWS for Iceberg REST catalogs. There is sort of a very concrete decision on like which what kind of an STS session policy to apply, and whether that, you know, includes read only or read and list or read and list and write and delete, for example. So I think if Jack had a PR out a while back that's been hanging that about expressing this intent in load table. And yeah, maybe I'm rambling a little bit, so apologies. But I guess the maybe the question is, do we want to lean into this concept where it is a concept of like scoping yourself down, like as a defense in depth, right? To be able to scope things down or not.
So that is a good question. I think in principle, it sounds great, right? In principle, like I only need the ability to read. Therefore, I'm gonna get a read credential. It sounds nice. However, what we're talking about is a situation in which an attacker can get a, essentially credential or bearer token from the client. And so are there enough situations, because this is a lot more complex. What we would have to do is separate the credential stuff from the actual table load. So rather than getting the permissions you have on the table, you say, here are the permissions I need, and we check whether you can have those permissions. We would need to separate that. We would need to deal with caching those things because we cache tables and your purpose for using the table might differ and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, we're talking about an attack surface where an attacker has gained the ability to get a very specific string out, or in this case, 3 very specific strings out of a single class somewhere in memory. And if that is the case, why would you not just have the attacker get the original credential of the user or the bearer token of the user? Those things are actually a whole lot more accessible and more likely to be leaked than these narrow scoped down credentials. So I'm not sure that we are talking about an attack surface that is reasonably differentiated from something that would give you the, the full credentials of a user versus even just a, read credential for a table.
I'll Jack go first, but I think there's an interesting part there.
Yeah, I just want to explain about, like, for example, the like passing intent and credential vending, all those things we put up. There is a very specific boundary we set when for a very similar feature that Glue Data Catalog has today. Because if you look into the APIs in Glue Data Catalog, there are actually 2 sets of APIs. The first set of API are user-facing APIs, and the second set is for engine integrations. So the intent is that engine is acting as a part of the system and is serving as a part of the trusted entities to make calls on behalf of the user. And only in that case, we are saying that you can vend credentials because you are kind of a part of our internal system, and we are just giving you access for whatever user's current identity doesn't have access to. And or we are or the engine is passing the intent, saying that actually I'm doing a select, so I will pass this intent to the catalog. So it prevents some additional things. So we do make that distinction. And the question I think applied to here is more about, do we also want to make a distinction for some APIs should be more for engine integration, some APIs for more user-facing things? I think as of today, this, at least in the load table, it's kind of a mixed situation that I think there are some ways to tune in the header about what behavior should the catalog do, but they are not separate APIs. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the background here.
Yeah, and I guess I wanted to add to the what Jack says about this delegation point, because I think that's what's important. Because Ryan, you made an excellent point about, like, yes, in some cases, if we're talking about where the user's base credential is sort of what dictates what they can access, and they can access a superset. If we're just talking about scoping down what that user has, then maybe it's a moot point. But where it becomes particularly relevant is that there is a chain of delegation where if where the credential vending is vending a credential as potentially a more powerful, system user that has latent access to lots of things. This is the classic credential vending case, right? Where in this case, when we're saying downscoping, we're talking about maybe in this case, it's not that the user who's making the call is downscoping their credential or their privileges just for defense in depth, but rather that what that user asserts that they want to access, it's something that we would validate as part of as part of the access control.
But aren't we already doing that by narrowing scope? So the catalog has some identity that it comes with. It does an exchange for a user token, right? Typically, I am acting on behalf of, Dan Weeks. And then we go and say, I am acting on behalf of Dan Weeks and loading this table, and we get a token. And then we actually, get these credentials. So we've already downscoped to, from this sort of universal system identity to, who am I acting on behalf of? And then what resource am I actually accessing? So we have that downscoping.
But not the action.
Whether a further level of downscoping is valuable.
Right, and so that covers the resource level. But so let's say Dan doesn't have any latent access to S3, and Ryan also doesn't have any latent access to S3. And then the catalog, in the catalog, you've told the catalog that, okay, Ryan is allowed to both read and write, but Dan is only allowed to read. Now the catalog is only handing out credentials using the system, it's chipping off subsets of the system privilege in credential vending, right? So
actually I would not think of it that way. So I don't think of this as, and this depends entirely on your catalog backend. But the way I think of it is I have a credential that identifies the catalog, and I know that this catalog can act on behalf of users, right? It can be a delegate, if you will, or an actor, but it only has the permissions that Dan has or that I have when actually accessing data, because it's acting on behalf of those users. So it doesn't have any latent access to S3 itself. We just trust that it partitions that access to S3 responsibly. And so I don't know that we would, again, when we get down to the level of this this engine acting on behalf of some user to access some resource.
Yeah,
I don't know if that
was the point that I was trying to make, is that hey, when somebody is interfacing with the catalog, if I'm doing a load table operation and it's handing me back vended credentials, those vended credentials should reflect my permissions, however, your RBAC, your ABAC, whatever it is associated to that particular table and the locations underneath it, and what that table owns. When Ryan goes and loads that, the vended credentials should respect whatever his privileges are. The intent of what I plan to do with that doesn't really matter. And this is true for everything that I can think about in the security scope is hey, when I have a credential, it reflects my permissions that were associated with me through whatever, IAM or role-based mechanism exists. So, and to Ryan's point is hey, if I already have that privilege and I'm just expressing my intent, if I can express a downscoped intent of hey, I just want to read as opposed to read and write, I can also ask to write. So there's no differentiation between trying to downscope that for me, with the exception of somehow it leaks at that one little point between when I ask and when I get it back. Because if I'm compromised, they can go ask for write. Write or delete. It's the intent doesn't really add security.
There is a small surface area where this would matter, which is that if there's a bug that exposes the credentials in a S3 file IO versus a bug that exposes, a user access token, then it wouldn't, in a narrow sense, matter. But is that enough to justify a new endpoint, a different way of getting credentials, like all of those things? I'm not convinced that there is. Christian?
Yeah, so I have recently been thinking a little bit about the same thing, and the solution for me is having an OAuth-enabled catalog and just having the client or the federated compute exchange the token with the OAuth provider before, basically managing impersonation on that level. So this way, this way the client would actually never send a token with too many permissions to the catalog, because the exchange happens before with the IDP to assume a lower level role.
Oh, I think you're assuming, it sounds like what you're assuming is the client is giving a broad access token to the catalog, and the catalog is downscoping that token. That's not what we're talking about.
And would that also require, so would that be for cases where the storage layer knows how to cooperate with the token? Like, are you talking about complete pass-through of
so the way that a client identifies itself to the catalog is entirely separate, or can be entirely separate, depending on how you want to design it, from anything related to any sort of actual physical access. Those can be two completely different things.
Exactly.
So my identity, I have to carry with me to the catalog to just talk to the catalog.
Yes, but if I have impersonation on this level, it allows me to do exactly what this additional endpoint would do, namely to scope down permissions by assuming a different role.
Yeah, I think that could happen because, for example, if you have suppose read and write permission, and you want to, for this particular operation, you want to scope down to the reader only, that's completely possible with OAuth roles. You just give them different principles. I mean, principal scope. Sorry.
Right.
Give different scope.
Right. So I could say, hey, I'm a catalog, or sorry, I'm an engine acting on behalf of Dan Weeks as a read-only role, right? But then the question is, like, how do you manage that intent? Because I could definitely create for every user a read-write role and a read-only role, and in some cases, only access through the read-only role. That's possible today. In fact, we thought about doing this and having like read-only credentials, so that you can partition data between prod and test, for example. So you create a credential that has read-write access to prod and read-only access to test, and therefore you're not going to write prod data into test. You can't. But that's not this level of intent, which is based on like, well, what query did the user just run, right? What query am I analyzing and trying to run right now? That is more of a structural role-based approach.
And the way I would think about that in context of like, traditional databases, it's not like what query you run. It's like what set role operation you performed before you ran that query. That's changing your principal effectively, right? So if we're talking about doing that, that's actually like a client-side operation that has to change its identity in some way or some aspect of its identity. So it's then signaling to the catalog. It's not a matter of like the API of like, how do we load a table?
Set role, dweeks, read only.
So you change the principal. And now when I communicate with the catalog, I have a different identity that I'm presenting to the catalog.
That is an interesting point. So I guess in a way you can express it as like automatic. I guess you could have some automatic or implicitly defined roles that represent the subsets already. So that if you're calling as a different subset of some other of the broader logical permissions, I guess in a way that's the same thing, or it accomplishes the same thing as expressing intent of the query.
And the way that like, going back to Christian's point, like I think what you're describing is almost kind of the setup with like I'll use AWS as an example because then Jack can correct me. But like I have my role and my privileges. I can go to STS, I can downscope my role, and then I can go hit a service with like just the things that I need to talk to that service. But isn't me talking to that service and saying, hey, but only give me these things. Like this is my intent.
Yeah.
That's not how that works. And in this context, it would be, I need to change my principle and identity that I'm using to communicate with the catalog to reflect what my new role is that the catalog understands.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes. I mean, I think that there is an element of like where because we're talking about like which credentials could be stolen. Like you could steal both credentials, but they can have different things like network policies, right? So they have different exploitation implications, for example. So you might have network policies might have made it safe that even if somebody steals your OAuth, your principal token, you're okay. But then maybe you didn't have the network policy at the STS level, or maybe if AWS wasn't able to enforce that for some reason, or something else wasn't able to, then I guess you can still work around it by explicitly defining a role that only grants the lesser token if you're worried about that. So that's a good point. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to think through whether that also solves the problem then. Like if we're expressing intent of like column access and like wanting to obtain a different set of credentials, that's another thing. It's like, so suppose, I guess it becomes more clear if it did become vending a set of encryption keys, or for column modular level encryption for column access, would you still want to extend this concept to say like, okay, for all my select queries, I get my full set of keys that my principal has access to, or should it be dynamic?
I gotta pause here because we've got like 3 or 4 minutes left, and keys are a whole different beast because the way we manage keys, like you can basically use that to always access, like you can just continue using the key, right? There's no expiration for the key because you're not coming back to the service. You're not going to S3 with this token. Like keys are a very, very different space of security problem. Like, because we've got to actually go rewrite and re-encrypt that data in order to revoke any key that I have shown you, or any key that has been in the end encrypted with the key that I've shown you. And that's how we're doing table encryption right now, is like you take your file keys and you put them into the manifest and you encrypt that manifest with a key, and then you put that in the manifest list, and then you encrypt the manifest list with a key, and then so it's, if I give you the root key that can decrypt a manifest list, you can read all of the keys in the table.
Right.
Now, granted, we could have like multiple key paths and like, duplicate some things, so I can give you a key that has access to only the main data key and not a sensitive data key or something like that. But still, like, I can't revoke those keys. They are, tied to bytes on disk. Yeah. So like there's a very different situation in terms of that. And I don't think we have time to go into that. Yeah. Even explaining that I don't think we have time took like 3 minutes. Thanks. That was a fun discussion.
Yeah, I think we are at time. Any other comments before we close the meeting?
Well, I mean, the follow-up discussion we probably should. I mean, we could include it as an agenda item, or I guess mailing list would be good. As you say, that is a fun discussion, and yes, I think there's certainly more to discuss.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.